You think you know the person sleeping next to you. You think the vows you took at the altar mean something, that the life you are building together is built on solid ground. But greed is a funny, insidious thing. It strips the mask off the devil you married. When Molly, 6 months pregnant and fiercely mourning the sudden death of her seemingly penniless father, was handed divorce papers by her husband Paul, her world shattered. He was leaving her for a younger, flashier woman, convinced Molly was nothing but dead weight holding back his ambitions. He wanted a clean break. He wanted everything. What Paul didn't know, however, was that the quiet, flannel-wearing father Molly had just buried wasn't just a small-town mechanic. He was a silent trillionaire. And Paul had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. Molly Davenport stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of their leased apartment in Chicago's Gold Coast, gently resting a hand on her swelling stomach. At 6 months pregnant, the baby was kicking more than ever, a tiny fluttering of life that brought her immense joy. Molly, a talented freelance graphic designer, had always been a grounding force. With her rich, deep brown skin and a halo of natural curls she usually kept tied back in a silk scarf, she possessed a quiet, radiant beauty. Her husband, Paul Davenport, was the stark opposite. Pale, meticulously groomed with slicked-back blonde hair, and always encased in a tailored charcoal suit, Paul was a junior vice president at Crestwood Financial. He was a man obsessed with optics, climbing the corporate ladder with a ruthless, exhausting hunger. When they met 5 years ago, Paul had found Molly's down-to-earth nature refreshing. But as he began earning more, his tastes changed. He started obsessing over country club memberships, $500 dinners at Alinea, and rubbing elbows with Chicago's elite. Molly didn't care for that world. She was raised in Oak Haven, a sleepy town in upstate New York, by her single father, Richard Sterling. Richard was a man of few words and calloused hands. To Molly, and to the rest of the world, Richard was simply a mechanic who owned a dusty, failing auto repair shop. He lived in a modest, peeling 2-bedroom house, drove a 1998 Ford F-150, and wore flannel shirts until the elbows gave out. Whenever Molly tried to send him money, he would gently refuse, telling her to save it for her family. Paul despised Richard. He saw his father-in-law as a blue-collar embarrassment. Is he going to show up to the baby shower in those grease-stained boots? Paul had sneered just weeks prior, aggressively adjusting his Rolex Submariner. Molly, the partners from the firm are going to be there. I can't have him talking about carburetor repairs while we're pouring Dom Perignon. He's my father, Paul, Molly had replied softly, swallowing the lump of hurt in her throat. He works hard, and he's excited to be a grandfather. Paul had merely rolled his eyes, pouring himself a glass of scotch. The distance between them had been growing for months. Paul was coming home later and later, smelling of sharp cologne that wasn't his phone always placed face down on the granite counter. Molly blamed the stress of the impending baby and his demanding job. She chose to trust him because the alternative was too devastating to consider. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. It was the Oak Haven County Sheriff. Richard Sterling had collapsed in his garage. Massive heart attack. He was gone before the ambulance even arrived. Molly's knees gave out. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, a guttural, tearing sob escaping her chest. Her anchor, her quiet hero, the man who had braided her hair when her mother died and taught her how to change a tire, was dead. When Paul finally came home at 11 p.m., he found Molly curled on the sofa, clutching a framed photo of her and Richard. Her eyes were swollen shut from crying. "My dad is dead, Paul," she whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. Paul froze near the entryway. He didn't drop his briefcase. He didn't rush over to hold her. Instead, a brief, almost imperceptible flash of annoyance crossed his face before he composed his features into a mask of obligatory sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that, Molly," Paul said stiffly, loosening his tie. "I really am. But you know, he wasn't taking care of himself. It was bound to happen." Molly looked up, staring at the man she had married. There was no warmth in his blue eyes, just a cold, calculating emptiness. "I need to go to Oakhaven tomorrow," she said, her voice shaking, "to arrange the funeral. I need you with me." Paul sighed, glancing at his phone as it buzzed in his hand. "Molly, I can't. The Reynolds merger is closing this week. I can't just drop everything to go upstate to Oakhaven. Just put whatever funeral costs there are on the Amex. Keep it cheap, and I'll see you when you get back." He walked past her, heading to the master bedroom. Molly sat in the dark, the baby kicking against her ribs, and realized with terrifying clarity that she was entirely alone. The funeral in Oakhaven was sparse. A few local mechanics, the town baker, and the postman attended. Richard Sterling had lived a quiet, solitary life. Molly stood in the freezing rain, wearing a black maternity dress, weeping as the plain oak casket was lowered into the ground. Paul had, reluctantly, flown in for exactly 4 hours, spending most of the service typing emails on his BlackBerry under a large black umbrella, standing a few feet away from her. When they returned to Chicago 3 days later, Molly was physically and emotionally shattered. The grief was a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe, hard to eat. She needed her husband. She needed a safe harbor. Instead, she walked into their apartment to find Paul sitting at the glass dining table. 2 large leather suitcases were packed by the door. "What's going on?" Molly asked, dropping her keys. A cold spike of adrenaline pierced through her exhaustion. Paul didn't look up immediately. He slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "I'm done, Molly," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Molly stared at the envelope. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The room spun. She gripped the back of a dining chair to steady herself. "Paul, what? What are you talking about? I'm pregnant. I just buried my father 4 days ago." "And that's exactly why I have to do this now," Paul said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "You're an anchor, Molly. You have been for a long time. You don't fit into my world anymore. And frankly, I'm tired of pretending. Your father's dead. You have no assets. Your freelance business barely brings in 30 grand a year. And I am not dragging a crying woman and a baby into the prime of my career. You don't fit into my world anymore." The words echoed in her head, cruel and absolute. Before Molly could even process the cruelty of his words, the apartment door clicked open. A woman walked in. She was young, maybe 24. She had long, perfectly blown-out blonde hair, a spray tan, and was wearing a tight, cream-colored cashmere dress. On her wrist glinted a heavy Cartier love bracelet. "Are you almost ready, babe? The Uber is downstairs," the woman said, her voice a nasal drawl. She looked at Molly, her eyes sweeping over Molly's tear-stained face and pregnant belly with a mixture of pity and blatant disgust. "Oh, you're still here." Molly felt the air leave her lungs. "Who is this?" "This is Savannah," Paul said smoothly, stepping over to wrap an arm around the younger woman's waist. Savannah Price was a junior real estate agent who specialized in luxury condos. She was everything Paul thought he deserved: flashy, loud, and utterly superficial. "We've been seeing each other for 8 months. We're moving into a townhouse in Lincoln Park." 8 months? Since before Molly even found out she was pregnant. You're leaving me for her?" Molly choked out, the betrayal burning her throat like acid. "My father just died, Paul. I am carrying your child. And my lawyer will contact you about child support," Paul cut in sharply. "But let's be clear, Molly. The lease on this apartment is in my name. I'm breaking it at the end of the month. I've already moved the funds from our joint savings into my private account. You didn't contribute to it anyway. You have 30 days to get your things out." "You can't do this. Half of that money is mine," Molly yelled, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "Try proving that with the $400 in your checking account," Paul sneered. "Face it, Molly. You come from nothing and you are nothing. Go back to Oakhaven. Live in your dad's rotting house. It's where you belong." Savannah let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Come on, Paul. Let's go. It smells like depression in here." Paul grabbed his bags, walked out the door, and didn't look back. Molly sank to the floor, her hands clutching her stomach. The pain of the betrayal was so immense it felt physical. Paul had timed it perfectly. He waited until she was at her absolute lowest, stripped of her father, to pull the rug out from under her. He assumed she was weak. He assumed she was destitute. He had no idea what was coming. For 2 weeks, Molly lived in a fog of despair. She packed her belongings into cardboard boxes, surviving on cheap ramen and the kindness of a few friends who let her sleep on their couches. Paul's lawyers were aggressive, sending her documents demanding a swift, uncontested divorce, offering a pathetic lump sum of $15,000 to walk away quietly and waive alimony. Paul wanted to marry Savannah by Christmas, and he was bulldozing Molly to get it done. On a bleak Thursday morning, Molly was sitting in a rundown coffee shop when she received a certified letter forwarded from her old address. The envelope was thick, made of heavy, cream-colored linen paper. The return address read, "Caldwell, Whitfield, and Sterling Attorneys at Law 1 World Trade Center, Suite 8500, New York, N1." Molly frowned. Sterling? It had to be a coincidence. She opened the letter. It was from a man named Harrison Caldwell, requesting her immediate presence in New York for the reading of Richard Sterling's last will and testament. Enclosed was a first-class ticket to JFK on Delta and a reservation confirmation for the Plaza Hotel. Molly stared at the ticket. Her father. First-class flights? The Plaza? There had to be a mistake. Richard didn't even have a credit card. He paid for his groceries with crumpled $20 bills. Despite her confusion, Molly had nothing left to lose. The next day, she boarded the flight to New York. Walking into the offices of Caldwell, Whitfield, and Sterling, Molly felt entirely out of place in her oversized maternity sweater and worn boots. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and glass, overlooking the Manhattan skyline. A receptionist in a sharp suit immediately stood up. "Mrs. Davenport, Mr. Caldwell has been expecting you. Please, right this way." She was led into a massive mahogany boardroom. Sitting at the head of a long table was a distinguished older man with silver hair, wearing a bespoke 3-piece suit. He stood up immediately, his eyes softening as he looked at Molly. "Molly, my dear, you look so much like your mother," Harrison Caldwell said gently, extending his hand. Molly shook it, utterly bewildered. "I'm sorry. Did you know my parents?" "I knew your father very well," Harrison said, gesturing for her to sit in a plush leather chair. He poured her a glass of sparkling water. "Richard and I go back 40 years. I am the executor of his estate and, well, his oldest friend." "I don't understand," Molly said, gripping her glass. "My dad was a mechanic. He never mentioned you. Why am I here? Are there debts? Because my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, took everything. I don't have any money to pay off my dad's house." Harrison stopped. He looked at Molly, his expression shifting from gentle warmth to sharp, calculated intelligence. "Your husband is divorcing you? Paul Davenport?" "Yes. He left me 2 weeks ago, for another woman." A slow, terrifyingly cold smile spread across Harrison Caldwell's face. It was the smile of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. "I see," Harrison murmured, opening a thick leather binder on the table. "Well, Molly, I believe Mr. Davenport has made a severe miscalculation. Let me tell you a story about your father." Harrison leaned forward, clasping his hands. "Your father was not just a mechanic, Molly. In 1988, Richard developed a highly specialized drilling mechanism for rare earth mineral extraction. He patented it quietly. He then used the royalties to become a silent foundational seed investor in 3 of the largest tech companies in the world before they ever went public." Molly's heart began to pound in her ears. "What?" "Richard was a brilliant, eccentric man," Harrison continued. "He hated the spotlight. He hated high society. When your mother passed away, he wanted you to grow up normal, grounded. He didn't want you surrounded by sycophants and vultures. So he built a shell corporation, Aegis Global Holdings." Harrison pushed a document toward her. It was a financial summary. Molly's eyes scanned the numbers, but her brain couldn't process the zeros. "Through Aegis," Harrison said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Your father owns vast lithium mines in South America, substantial commercial real estate in London and Tokyo, and majority shares in a dozen sovereign wealth funds. He lived in that small house in Oakhaven because he liked it. He liked fixing cars. But his actual net worth, Molly—" Harrison paused, letting the silence build, "is conservatively estimated at $1.2 trillion. Molly dropped her glass. It shattered on the floor, water pooling on the expensive rug. A trillion?" she gasped, clutching her chest, struggling to breathe. That's impossible. People would know. The government would know." "We employ the best tax attorneys and privacy firms on the planet," Harrison said calmly, ignoring the broken glass. "Your father was the ghost in the global machine, and as his sole heir, Molly, Aegis Global Holdings now belongs entirely to you." Molly sat frozen. Her mind flashed to Paul. Paul, sneering at her father's boots. Paul, telling her she was nothing. Paul, locking her out of their meager $40,000 savings account. "There is a stipulation," Harrison noted, tapping the will. "Richard was a paranoid man, bless his heart. He put an ironclad clause in the inheritance. The assets are placed in a blind trust that only vests to you. In the event of a divorce, no spouse is entitled to a single penny of the principal or the dividends. It is untouchable by Paul." Molly let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. A strange, unfamiliar feeling began to bloom in her chest. It wasn't grief. It wasn't despair. It was power. "Paul's lawyers sent me divorce papers," Molly said softly, her voice steadying. "They are demanding I sign a waiver of all marital assets for a $15,000 payout to expedite the divorce. He wants it done fast so he can marry his mistress." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "And what would you like to do, Molly?" Molly looked down at her pregnant belly. She thought of the tears she had shed on the floor of that apartment. She thought of Savannah's mocking laughter. "I want to sign his papers," Molly said, a dangerous spark igniting in her dark eyes. "I want to give Paul exactly what he's asking for. A quick, cheap divorce where he walks away thinking he's won. But before I do, I want to buy the firm he works for." Harrison Caldwell threw his head back and laughed, a rich, booming sound that filled the boardroom. "Oh, my dear," Harrison said, his eyes gleaming, We are going to have a lot of fun." The pen felt lighter than air as Molly dragged it across the signature line of the divorce decree. She sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit office of Paul's aggressive divorce attorney, a balding man named Thomas Sterling, no relation to her profound relief. Paul sat across the mahogany table, looking incredibly smug in a navy Brioni suit. Savannah, of course, was absent, likely maxing out one of Paul's credit cards at the Prada boutique on Oak Street. "There," Molly said, pushing the document across the table. "You have your uncontested divorce. I waive all rights to alimony, your 401k and the apartment. Give me the $15,000 check." Paul's lawyer scrutinized the signature, his eyes darting to Paul with a satisfied nod. Paul leaned back, a patronizing smile playing on his pale face. "I have to say, Molly, I'm surprised," Paul remarked, sliding a cashier's check across the table. "I thought you'd put up more of a fight, try to bleed me dry, but I suppose you finally realized you don't have the resources to drag this out. It's the smart play. Oak Haven is cheap." Molly picked up the check, her perfectly manicured fingers, a recent, subtle upgrade, brushing the paper. She looked at the man she had loved, the man who was discarding her and their unborn child because they didn't fit his aesthetic. There was no anger left in her chest, only a chilling, absolute calm. "I don't need to bleed you dry, Paul," Molly said softly, standing up and smoothing her understated but impeccably tailored black maternity coat. "You do a fine job of doing that to yourself. Congratulations on your freedom." She walked out of the law office, stepped into the private elevator, and pressed the button for the parking garage. When the doors opened, she didn't walk to the subway. Instead, a sleek, black Maybach was idling near the exit. A driver in a crisp uniform immediately opened the rear door. Inside, Harrison Caldwell was waiting, tapping away on an iPad. "Is the deed done, my dear?" the silver-haired attorney asked without looking up. "Signed, sealed, and delivered," Molly said, settling into the plush leather seat. "He thinks he's won." He practically gloated. Harrison chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. Men like Paul Davenport mistake cruelty for strength and silence for weakness. They never see the avalanche until it's already crushed them. "Now, let's get down to business. I have the paperwork ready for the acquisition." Over the next 2 months, Molly Davenport ceased to exist. In her place, Molly Sterling emerged, operating entirely from the shadows of a $15 million penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, purchased under a subsidiary shell company of Aegis Global Holdings. She hired a private staff, a nutritionist, a team of elite OB-GYNs, and an executive assistant named Sarah Jenkins, a razor-sharp woman poached from a rival hedge fund. Molly spent her days learning the vast, dizzying empire her father had built. She reviewed global shipping logistics, lithium mining yields, and real estate portfolios. But her true focus, her passion project, was Crestwood Financial. Crestwood Financial was a mid-tier, aggressive wealth management firm in Chicago. It was profitable, but vulnerable. Paul was a junior vice president there, desperate to make senior partner. He worshipped the firm's CEO, William Bradley. "We don't just buy the firm, Harrison," Molly had instructed during one of their daily briefings, resting her hands on her now 8-month pregnant belly. "I want a hostile, aggressive, and entirely anonymous takeover. I want William Bradley to feel the squeeze, and I want him to pass that pressure directly down to his VPs, especially Paul. I want Paul's expense accounts audited. I want his client list scrutinized. I want him sweating through his tailored suits." Harrison smiled his shark-like smile. "Consider it done, Madam Chairman. Aegis Global will initiate a leverage buyout. Within 3 weeks, We will own 85% of their voting stock." While Molly orchestrated her chessboard, Paul was busy planning his happily ever after. He and Savannah had moved into a sprawling, wildly overpriced townhouse in Lincoln Park. To keep up with Savannah's insatiable appetite for luxury, Paul was secretly taking out massive personal loans, relying on a promised year-end bonus at Crestwood to keep them afloat. They were planning a $200,000 wedding at the Drake Hotel, set for just weeks after the ink dried on his divorce. Paul thought he was climbing to the top of the world. He had no idea the mountain he was standing on belonged to his ex-wife. The atmosphere inside Crestwood Financial was suffocating. Paul loosened his tie, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the red ink on his quarterly report. For the past month, the firm had been in a state of sheer panic. Rumors of a massive corporate takeover had proven true. An invisible, monolithic entity, known only as Aegis Global Holdings, had bought them out. The new overlords were ruthless. They had immediately fired the entire HR department and installed their own auditors. Every corporate credit card was frozen. Every expense over $50 required triplicate approval. Paul's phone buzzed. It was Savannah. "Babe, the florist just called. The deposit for the imported white orchids bounced. Fix it. The wedding is in a month." Paul ground his teeth, typing back a hasty, reassuring reply while his stomach churned. He was heavily over-leveraged. He had bet everything on a massive promotion to senior partner, which came with a 7-figure buy-in bonus. If he didn't get that promotion, he was bankrupt. Suddenly, his office door opened. William Bradley, the CEO of Crestwood, stood in the doorway looking 10 years older than he had a month ago. He looked terrified. "Paul, boardroom." "Now," William snapped. Paul grabbed his suit jacket, pasting on his confident, golden boy smile. "Of course, William. Is this about the Reynolds portfolio? Because I can explain the slight dip." "Shut up, Paul," William hissed as they walked down the glass-walled corridor. "The representatives from Aegis Global are here. They are doing a top-down review of all VPs to decide who stays and who gets liquidated. You need to impress them. If we lose any more ground, we're both out on the street." Paul's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. This was his moment to charm the new owners, to prove he was the elite dealmaker he claimed to be. They entered the massive, sunlit boardroom. At the far end of the long oak table sat 3 people. 2 were men in dark suits, lawyers or fixers clearly, but seated in the center, her back turned to them as she looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, was a woman. "Gentlemen," William Bradley said, his voice actually shaking. "Thank you for coming. May I present Paul Davenport, one of our top." "I know exactly who Mr. Davenport is," a woman's voice cut in. The voice was calm, rich, and painfully familiar. Paul froze. The blood drained from his face, rushing to his feet in a dizzying whoosh. He knew that voice. But it was impossible. It couldn't be. The plush leather chair slowly rotated. Sitting at the head of the table, dressed in a custom-tailored, stark white maternity suit that contrasted beautifully with her flawless, deep brown skin, was Molly. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly terrifying. Around her neck rested a vintage diamond tennis necklace, and her natural curls were pinned up in an elegant, commanding style. Her pregnant belly was prominent, a silent testament to the life Paul had abandoned. William Bradley looked confused. "Madam Chairman, you know Mr. Davenport?" Paul couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. He gripped the edge of the boardroom table, his knuckles turning white. "Molly?" he whispered, his voice cracking. What are you doing here? How did you get past security?" Molly didn't smile. She looked at him the same way one might look at a stain on the sidewalk. "I didn't need to get past security, Paul," Molly said, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. She leaned forward, clasping her hands on the table. "I own the building." Paul's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His brain was misfiring, desperately trying to reconcile the penniless, grieving woman he had discarded with the trillion-dollar titan sitting before him. "William," Molly said, not breaking eye contact with Paul. "Mr. Davenport's expense reports for the last 3 years have been brought to my attention. He has been using client funds to subsidize a lavish personal lifestyle, masking them as entertainment expenses, including, it seems, jewelry for his mistress. Is that the standard of ethics Crestwood upholds?" William Bradley turned a horrific shade of grey. He looked at Paul, realizing instantly that Paul was a dead man walking. "No, Madam Chairman, absolutely not. I had no idea." You bought Aegis?" Paul stammered, his mind entirely broken. "With what money? Your dad was a mechanic." "My father," Molly said, her voice turning dangerously cold, "was the founder of Aegis Global. And when you threw me out like garbage because you thought I was poor, because you thought my grief was an inconvenience to your ambition, you legally waived your right to a single cent of a $1.2 trillion empire." Molly pulled a manila folder from the table. She opened it and slid a single piece of paper toward Paul. "This is a notice of immediate termination for gross financial misconduct," Molly stated. "Because of the nature of your fraud, we are also reporting you to the SEC. You are stripped of your licenses, Paul. You are blacklisted from every financial institution on Wall Street. And because you waived your rights to my assets for a pathetic $15,000, you have exactly nothing." Paul collapsed into one of the boardroom chairs, hyperventilating. The reality of what he had done, what he had thrown away for a shiny fake life with Savannah, came crashing down on him like a physical blow. "Molly, please," Paul begged, tears springing to his eyes, his carefully curated arrogance shattering into a million pieces. "I made a mistake. I was stressed. I'm sorry. We have a baby on the way. You can't do this to the father of your child." Molly stood up slowly, her presence dominating the room. "You stopped being a father the day you packed your bags and told me I was dead weight," Molly said, turning to walk toward the private exit. She paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. "Security is waiting in your office, Paul. They will escort you out. I suggest you tell Savannah to cancel the florist." The walk from the boardroom to his corner office felt like a death march for Paul. Flanked by 2 towering security guards in dark suits, he stumbled through the glass-paneled corridors of Crestwood Financial, the bullpen usually buzzing with the frantic energy of junior brokers and analysts, had gone dead silent. Dozens of eyes tracked his every move. Whispers rippled through the cubicles like a shockwave. Paul Davenport, the golden boy, the untouchable closer, was being escorted out like a common thief. When he reached his office, a cardboard box already sat on his desk. "Personal items only, Mr. Davenport," one of the guards stated, crossing his arms. "Company laptop, phone and client files remain here." Paul's hands shook violently as he grabbed a framed photo of himself and William Bradley on a golf course in Pebble Beach. He tossed it into the box, along with his monogrammed Mont Blanc pens. He reached for his company-issued iPhone, a desperate instinct to call Savannah, but the guard's hand clamped down over his wrist. "Personal items only," the guard repeated, his voice devoid of sympathy. 10 minutes later, Paul found himself standing on the pavement of West Wacker Drive. The biting Chicago wind whipped through his thin suit jacket. He had no job. He had no severance. The SEC was going to dismantle his life piece by piece, auditing every fraudulent expense he had filed to buy Savannah her Cartier bracelets and front-row tickets to the Lyric Opera. He hailed a cab, his stomach twisting into agonizing knots. The ride back to the Lincoln Park townhouse was a blur of mounting panic. How was he going to pay the $12,000 monthly rent? How was he going to pay off the $150,000 personal loan he took out to fund the wedding? He had banked his entire existence on the senior partner promotion and the quiet assumption that he would eventually bully Molly into taking on some of their marital debt. Instead, Molly was a trillionaire. She was the apex predator, and he was nothing but plankton. Paul burst through the heavy oak doors of the townhouse. The entryway smelled strongly of expensive lilies and Santol 33. Savannah was sitting cross-legged on the massive white linen sectional sofa in the living room. She was wearing a silk robe, a glass of rosé in one hand, aggressively flipping through a Vera Wang bridal catalogue. Surrounding her were fabric swatches and catering menus. "Paul, finally!" Savannah whined, not looking up. The florist was being incredibly rude. "You need to wire them the 15 grand today, or we lose the imported orchids. And I decided I want a string quartet for the cocktail hour, not a harpist. A harpist is too outdated." Paul dropped his cardboard box on the imported rug. The thud made Savannah jump. She finally looked at him, her perfectly arched eyebrows knitting together in annoyance. "What are you doing home at 2 in the afternoon?" she asked, her eyes darting to the box. "Did you bring me lunch from Le Colonial?" "Savannah, put the magazine down," Paul rasped, his voice sounding completely hollow. He walked over and collapsed into an armchair, burying his face in his trembling hands. "What is wrong with you?" she demanded, setting her wine glass on the marble coffee table. "Are you sick? You're ruining the mood. I'm trying to plan our dream wedding." "There is no wedding, Savannah," Paul whispered, looking up. His eyes were bloodshot, his perfectly coiffed hair disheveled. "There are no orchids. There is no string quartet. I got fired." Savannah froze. A chilling stillness washed over her features. The bubbly, affectionate persona she wore like a cheap coat instantly evaporated. "What do you mean? Fired? You're Paul Davenport. You bring in millions. Did William fire you?" "William didn't fire me," Paul said, a hysterical, broken laugh escaping his throat. "The new owner of the firm fired me. The new owner of the firm who just bought out the entire board, froze my accounts, and reported me to the SEC for embezzling funds to pay for your jewelry and this apartment." Savannah stood up slowly. "Who is the new owner? Paul?" Paul looked at the woman he had destroyed his marriage for. He looked at the shallow, demanding, insatiable creature he had chosen over his fiercely loyal, pregnant wife. "It's Molly," Paul choked out, tears finally spilling down his pale cheeks. "It's Molly. Her father wasn't just a mechanic. He was a silent billionaire. A trillionaire, Savannah. She owns the firm. She owns everything. She set me up. I signed away all my rights to her assets for $15,000 so I could marry you, and she took everything I had left." For 10 excruciating seconds, the only sound in the massive, echoing townhouse was the hum of the central heating. Savannah didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't rush to comfort him. Instead, her eyes narrowed into sharp, calculating slits. She looked at Paul not with pity, but with profound, absolute disgust. "You idiot!" she hissed, her voice venomous. Paul flinched. "Savannah, please, we can figure this out. We can downsize. I can try to get a job at a boutique firm." "Are you deaf?" Savannah snapped, marching toward the master bedroom. "You're blacklisted. The SEC is investigating you. You have no money, no job, and you practically handed $1 trillion fortune back to your ex-wife on a silver platter because you were too stupid to run a background check on her family. Paul scrambled to his feet, following her. "Savannah, wait! I did this for us. I did this because I love you." Savannah pulled 3 large Louis Vuitton trunks from the closet and threw them onto the king-sized bed. She began violently tossing her designer clothes, shoes, and handbags into them. "You didn't do this for me, Paul. You did this because you have an ego the size of Manhattan," she spat, not pausing her packing. "I am 24 years old. I am not spending the prime of my life living in a studio apartment in the suburbs, visiting my husband in federal prison. The wedding is cancelled. Lose my number." "You can't leave me," Paul screamed, grabbing her arm. "I left my pregnant wife for you." Savannah yanked her arm away, her acrylic nails digging into his skin. "And that should have been my first clue that you were a loser. You walked out on her when she had nothing. I'm walking out on you because you are nothing." She zipped her bags, called an Uber Black, and walked out the front door without a backward glance. Paul stood alone in the center of the vast, empty living room. His phone began to ring. It was the bank, calling about his overdrawn accounts. Paul sank to his knees on the cold hardwood floor, finally realizing the horrifying magnitude of what he had thrown away. He had traded a diamond for a piece of shattered glass, and now he was bleeding out. 5 months later, the brutal, biting Chicago winter had finally surrendered to a vibrant, hopeful spring. On the top floor of the prestigious Prentice Women's Hospital, the atmosphere inside the secure, private VIP birthing suite was a sanctuary of absolute peace. The massive, soundproofed windows offered an uninterrupted, glittering view of Lake Michigan, the water a brilliant sapphire under the morning sun. Inside the suite, there were no chaotic monitors beeping aggressively, no sterile hospital smells. Instead, the room was filled with the soft scent of white hydrangeas and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of new life. Molly Sterling sat up against a mountain of plush pillows, her deep brown skin glowing with the unmistakable, exhausted radiance of a new mother. Her dark curls, usually pinned up in her now signature commanding style, tumbled loosely over her shoulders. Resting against her chest, wrapped in a pristine white cashmere hospital blanket, was a perfect, healthy baby boy. He had a shock of dark, curly hair and deep, incredibly observant eyes that seemed to take in the world with a quiet intensity. The heavy mahogany door to the suite clicked open softly. Harrison Caldwell stepped inside, removing his bespoke charcoal fedora. The silver-haired attorney, who managed the legal labyrinth of Aegis Global Holdings, had become far more than just legal counsel to Molly over the past few months. In the absence of her father, Harrison had stepped into the role of a fiercely protective surrogate uncle. "He's perfect, Madam Chairman," Harrison whispered, his usually sharp, shark-like eyes softening as he approached the bed. He set a small, velvet jeweler's box on the bedside table. A small token, a custom Patek Philippe, to be kept in the vault until his 18th birthday, of course. Molly looked down at the tiny life in her arms, a tear of pure, unadulterated joy slipping down her cheek and landing on the soft fabric of the baby's blanket. "You spoil us, Harrison," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Nonsense. The sole heir to the sterling empire deserves to know the time." Harrison chuckled softly, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "Have you settled on a name?" Molly gently traced the outline of her son's tiny ear. She thought about the dusty garage in Oak Haven, New York. She thought about the smell of motor oil, the worn flannel shirts, and the quiet, unassuming mechanic who had secretly conquered the global financial world just to ensure she would never be at the mercy of anyone. "His name is Richard," Molly said, her voice steady and resolute. Richard Paul Sterling. Harrison raised an immaculate silver eyebrow at the middle name. Paul, my dear. Are you certain? After everything that man tried to do to you? I am certain, Molly replied, her dark eyes flashing with a profound, unyielding calm. I want him to carry it not out of love, but out of a profound sense of irony. I want it to be a lifelong reminder to him of exactly what kind of man not to become. He will have the world at his fingertips, Harrison. He needs to know that true wealth isn't money. It's loyalty. It's integrity. It's the things his father threw away. In the months since she had orchestrated the corporate annihilation of Paul's career at Crestwood Financial, Molly had fully stepped into her terrifying power. But unlike the billionaires of Wall Street, who flaunted their wealth with super yachts and garish parties in the Hamptons, Molly operated like a phantom. She wielded the $1.2 trillion resources of Aegis Global Holdings from the shadows, prioritizing quiet dominance over loud vanity. When she returned to her $15 million penthouse in the Gold Coast a week later, the real work began. Molly transformed the sprawling top floor of her residence into a command center. While little Richard slept in a custom-built nursery down the hall, under the watchful eye of elite pediatric nurses, Molly sat at her massive oak desk, dismantling and rebuilding industries. She didn't just hoard the wealth, she weaponized it for good. She founded the Sterling Initiative, a multi-billion-dollar philanthropic arm. Her first order of business was Oakhaven. She bought the town's failing infrastructure, funded state-of-the-art trade schools in her father's name, and established an ironclad scholarship fund for children of single parents. She honored the quiet, hard-working man her father was by elevating the exact demographic of people that men like Paul Davenport usually ignored or stepped on. The global financial press was utterly fascinated, yet entirely frustrated by her. Forbes ran a cover story titled "The $1 Trillion Ghost," featuring a silhouetted rendering of a woman, as Molly strictly refused all interviews and public photographs. She preferred to let her ruthless business acumen, her aggressive acquisitions in sustainable energy, and her massive charitable donations speak for themselves. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly a year to the day her father had passed away, Molly sat in her home office. Her executive assistant, Sarah Jenkins, the razor-sharp operative she had poached months ago, stepped into the room holding a leather-bound folio. "Good afternoon, Miss Sterling," Sarah said, her tone crisp and professional. "I have the finalized quarterly reports for the South American lithium yields and the final legal updates regarding the Crestwood liquidation." Molly didn't look up from her laptop, where she was reviewing architectural plans for a new children's hospital wing. "Go ahead, Sarah." "The Securities and Exchange Commission has officially concluded their investigation into Paul Davenport," Sarah read, adjusting her glasses. "To avoid a lengthy federal trial and a guaranteed 15-year prison sentence, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The judge was not lenient." Molly finally paused, folding her hands on her desk. "And the restitution?" "He has been ordered to pay $850,000 to the firm's defrauded clients," Sarah stated. "Because his personal bank accounts were entirely drained by his former fiancée, Savannah Price, prior to her departure, and because all his assets were seized during the audit, he is entirely bankrupt. His wages will be garnished at the maximum legal limit for the rest of his natural life." Molly felt a brief, fleeting ping of pity deep in her chest, but it was quickly swallowed by the cold, hard reality of Paul's own choices. "Where is he working now?" Sarah flipped to the next page. "He is currently employed as a night shift logistics coordinator and heavy machinery loader at a commercial laundry facility in Cicero, Illinois. Minimum wage. He rents a 300-square-foot room above a dive bar on 54th Avenue. 50 miles away, on the grimy, industrial outskirts of Cicero, the deafening roar of industrial washing machines echoed through the humid, windowless warehouse. Paul Davenport pushed a heavy canvas cart filled with 300 pounds of wet, bleach-soaked hotel towels across the cracked concrete floor. His pale skin, once meticulously maintained with expensive moisturizers, was flushed red, covered in a sheen of grimy sweat. His hands, which used to wear a Rolex Submariner and sign multi-million-dollar portfolios, were raw, blistered, and cracked from the harsh industrial chemicals. "Davenport, move it! Those carts aren't going to load themselves!" His shift manager, a burly man with a thick Chicago accent, bellowed over the roar of the dryers. I'm moving! Paul rasped, his voice hoarse. His lungs burned. His back ached with a deep, persistent agony that no amount of cheap ibuprofen could touch. The buzzer blared, signaling the 3 a.m. lunch break. Paul dragged himself to the stark, fluorescent-lit break room. The air smelled of stale coffee, bleach, and despair. He collapsed into a plastic chair, his muscles trembling uncontrollably. He reached into the pocket of his generic, stain-covered work pants and pulled out his latest pay stub. He stared at the numbers. Gross pay, $640. Federal garnishment, SEC restitution, $320. Net take-home, $215.40. A suffocating, agonizing wave of panic and regret washed over him, so intense it made him physically nauseous. He couldn't afford his $600 rent for the dingy room above the bar. He was eating canned soup out of a microwave. He had no friends. He had no family. When he had reached out to his former colleagues at Crestwood, they had immediately blocked his number, treating him like a highly contagious disease. Savannah hadn't spoken to him since the day she packed her Louis Vuitton trunks and walked out of the Lincoln Park townhouse. He was a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own ruined life. Sitting on the break room table next to a discarded sandwich wrapper was a crumpled, month-old copy of the Wall Street Journal. A co-worker must have left it behind. Paul's hollow, bloodshot eyes drifted to the front page. There, below the fold, was a headline. Aegis Global Holdings pledges $500 million to Chicago urban development. Chairman C. Sterling cements status as city's most powerful unseen force. Paul's breath hitched in his throat. He stared at the name. C. Sterling. He closed his eyes, and a phantom memory assaulted him. He remembered the rain in Oak Haven. He remembered standing under an umbrella, typing emails, while his pregnant wife wept over the plain oak casket of a man he had deemed a blue-collar embarrassment. He remembered the sneer on his own face when he handed her those divorce papers, telling her she was dead weight. He remembered the feeling of absolute superiority when he told her she was nothing. He had held $1 trillion empire in his hands. He had held a fiercely loyal, beautiful woman who loved him unconditionally. He had held the mother of his child, and he had thrown it all into a wood chipper because he wanted to impress people who didn't care if he lived or died. A single, jagged sob tore its way out of Paul's throat, echoing in the empty break room. He buried his face in his blistered hands, weeping not just for the money, but for the horrifying, inescapable realization that he had built his own private hell, brick by arrogant brick. Back in the Gold Coast penthouse, the world was quiet. Molly dismissed Sarah for the evening and walked out onto the sprawling, private terrace. The Chicago skyline stretched out before her, a breathtaking metropolis of steel, glass, and ambition, glittering like a sea of diamonds against the night sky. The wind whipped her dark curls around her face, But she didn't feel the cold. She turned and looked through the glass doors into the warm, softly lit living room. On an oversized silk rug, baby Richard was practicing sitting up, surrounded by wooden blocks, giggling as his nanny clapped her hands. Months ago, she had stood in a much smaller apartment, her heart shattered into a million pieces, weeping over a man who viewed her as disposable. She had believed she was utterly powerless, adrift in a world that was entirely designed to break her. Paul had tried to bury her in the dirt, completely unaware that she was a seed planted by a giant, and now she had bloomed into something utterly untouchable. Molly took a deep breath of the crisp night air, a deep, resonant calm settling into her very bones. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was the architect of her own empire, the protector of her father's legacy, and the master of her own fate. The illusion of her past life was dead and gone, but the reality she had built from its ashes was magnificent. The story of Molly and Paul is a dramatic exploration of the devastating consequences of superficiality and unchecked greed. Paul's fatal flaw was his inability to recognize true value, discarding profound loyalty and genuine love for the hollow illusion of status and wealth. His betrayal, timed at Molly's most vulnerable moment, exposed a moral rot that ultimately engineered his own spectacular downfall. Conversely, Molly's journey is one of resilience and profound transformation. Inheriting a staggering, secret fortune didn't change her character. It merely amplified the grounded, formidable strength her father instilled in her. She weaponized Paul's arrogance against him, not through chaotic vengeance, but through cold, calculated corporate dominance. Ultimately, true power isn't found in flashy suits or country club memberships. It resides in quiet confidence, unyielding integrity, and the sharp, undeniable reality that those who underestimate the quiet ones often do so at their own absolute peril.